Hello there. It's me, your narrator for sleepless nights, ready to delve into another monotonous tale from the Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on medieval romance to look at something far less glamorous and infinitely more complicated, what sex was actually like in the Middle Ages. So before we begin, turn down the lights, get comfortable in your soft modern bed and let the world outside fade away. If you enjoy what you hear, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure at all. In the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let's travel back to a time when intimacy was anything but simple. Forget the sweeping romances you've seen in movies, the tales of knights and fair maidens driven by passionate, uncontrollable love. The reality of physical intimacy in the Middle Ages was a far cry from these sanitized fantasies. It was a world governed not by personal desire, but by a rigid, all-encompassing framework of rules, fears, and obligations. And at the very center of this framework, holding the strings to every aspect of life, from birth to death and everything in between, was the church. To understand sex in the Middle Ages, you must first understand that it was never a private matter. It was a public concern, a theological puzzle, and a moral battleground, and the church was the ultimate referee, judge, and jury. The church's influence over the medieval bedroom was absolute and inescapable. It wasn't just about issuing broad commandments. It was about micromanaging the most intimate details of a person's life. Theologians and priests, men who had taken vows of celibacy, spent an inordinate amount of time thinking, writing, and preaching about what people were doing in the privacy of their homes. Their starting point was a deep-seated suspicion of pleasure itself. Drawing from the teachings of early church fathers like St. Augustine, the prevailing view was that sex was an unfortunate necessity, a messy business required for procreation but inherently tainted by the sin of lust. The ideal state was virginity, a pure and holy devotion to God. Since not everyone could be a virgin, marriage was the only acceptable container for the messy act of procreation. Sex for any reason other than to have children within the confines of a Christian marriage was in essence a sin. This fundamental principle, that sex equals procreation, was the root of 1,000 different rules. The church, through sermons, confessionals, and written penitentials, laid out a bewilderingly complex list of do's and don'ts. Every act was scrutinized, categorized, and assigned a corresponding penance. The goal was to strip the act of any joy that might distract from its solemn reproductive purpose. Pleasure was seen as a slippery slope leading directly to damnation. It was the devil's candy, a momentary sweetness that could cost you your immortal soul. Therefore, the church did everything in its power to regulate not just who you had sex with, but how, when, and why. The why was simple: babies. Any sexual act that could not lead to conception was deemed unnatural and therefore sinful. This included everything from oral sex to masturbation to the use of any form of contraception. The how was even more restrictive. Theologians debated endlessly about the proper position for intercourse, concluding that only one was permissible: the so-called missionary position. Why? Because it was deemed the most natural and least pleasurable, the most efficient for the sole purpose of conception. Any other position was seen as a deviation, an indulgence in animalistic lust. A couple found to be experimenting with different positions could face years of penance, fasting on bread and water to purify their souls of the sin of enjoying themselves too much. The when was perhaps the most intrusive regulation of all. The church created a calendar of forbidden days, a veritable minefield of sexual prohibition. You were forbidden from having sex on Sundays because it was the Lord's Day. You were forbidden on Wednesdays and Fridays, in observance of fasting. You were forbidden during the entire 40 days of Lent, the weeks of Advent, and on numerous saints' days and other religious festivals. You were also forbidden from having sex when a woman was menstruating, pregnant, or breastfeeding. When you add it all up, a married couple might find that sex was prohibited for more than half the year. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a divine mandate. Breaking these rules meant risking God's wrath, which could manifest as a stillborn child, a deformed baby, or eternal damnation for both partners. The fear was a powerful tool of control, ensuring that even in the most private moments, the shadow of the church loomed large. This wasn't about fostering healthy relationships. It was about social and spiritual control, ensuring that the act of creation remained firmly under the dominion of God. as interpreted by the men in robes. Now that we've established the church's pervasive and rather gloomy oversight of all things intimate, let's turn to the only institution where sex was permitted at all: marriage. If you're picturing a medieval couple meeting, falling in love, and deciding to spend their lives together based on mutual affection and romantic connection, you need to gently set that image aside. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, particularly those with any land, title, or wealth to speak of, marriage had very little to do with love. It was a cold, hard, practical contract. It was a business merger, a political alliance, a way to secure property, and a means of producing legitimate heirs. Romance was a luxury few could afford, and personal choice was often completely absent from the equation. For the nobility and the landed gentry, marriage was the primary tool for consolidating power and wealth. It was how you secured your borders, ended feuds, and climbed the social ladder. A daughter was not a person so much as a political asset, a bargaining chip to be deployed in the great game of dynastic ambition. Marriages were arranged by parents, often when the prospective bride and groom were still children. A betrothal could be legally binding from the age of 7, and these children would be raised with the full understanding that their future spouse had already been chosen for them. Their personal feelings on the matter were entirely irrelevant. The goal was not to create a happy couple, but to forge a beneficial alliance that would serve the interests of the two families. The bride's dowry, land, money, or valuable goods, was a critical part of the negotiation. She was, in essence, being sold, and the price had to be right. The wedding ceremony itself was less a celebration of love and more a public formalization of this contract. The key moment was not the exchange of vows in a church, but the public declaration of consent and the physical joining of hands, often conducted at the church door. This was a legal proceeding, witnessed by the community, to ensure there were no impediments, such as a prior contract or close blood relationship. The focus was on the legitimacy of the union and the transfer of property. The bride, upon marriage, effectively ceased to be a legal entity. Her property, her rights, and her body now belonged to her husband. He was her lord and master, and she was expected to obey him in all things. This power imbalance was fundamental to the medieval understanding of marriage. For the lower classes, the peasants and artisans who made up the vast majority of the population, there was slightly more room for personal choice, but practicality still reigned supreme. A farmer needed a wife who was strong, healthy, and capable of running a household, working the fields, and, most importantly, bearing children who would provide extra hands for labor. A woman, in turn, needed a husband who could provide for her and protect her. Love might grow over time, a quiet affection born of shared hardship and mutual dependence, but it was rarely the initial catalyst. A potential spouse was evaluated based on their reputation for hard work, their small plot of land, or their family's standing in the village. It was a pragmatic decision based on survival. Within this contractual framework, sex had a very specific and decidedly unromantic role. It was, first and foremost, a duty. The primary purpose of marriage, according to both the church and society, was procreation. A wife's foremost obligation was to produce a male heir to inherit the family's name and property. The pressure to conceive, especially a son, was immense. A woman who failed to produce children or who only produced daughters could be seen as a failure. In aristocratic circles, a barren marriage could be grounds for an annulment, allowing the husband to set his wife aside and try again with someone else. This turned the marital bed into a place of profound anxiety rather than intimacy. Every sexual encounter was freighted with the weight of expectation. Furthermore, sex was considered a marital debt, debitum conjugal. This was a concept, formalized by theologians, which held that each spouse had a right to the other's body to avoid the sin of temptation. A husband or wife could not refuse the other's sexual advances without a legitimate reason, such as one of the many forbidden days on the church calendar. To do so was considered a sin, as it might drive the spurned partner to seek illicit pleasure elsewhere, such as with a prostitute or through masturbation. While this doctrine technically applied to both partners, the societal power structure meant it was overwhelmingly used to reinforce the husband's sexual authority over his wife. The idea of consent, as we understand it today, did not exist. A wife's body was her husband's property, and her refusal could be seen as a form of theft. This turned sex from a shared experience into a legal and religious obligation, a duty to be performed to prevent sin and produce heirs. stripping it of much of its potential for human connection and mutual pleasure. It was a transaction, a fulfillment of a contract, performed under the watchful eye of a God who seemed to be more concerned with rules than with love. Now that we have established marriage as a practical, often loveless contract with the primary goal of procreation, we must turn to the inevitable and terrifying consequence of that goal: childbirth. If the medieval marital bed was a place of anxiety and obligation, the birthing chamber was a place of profound terror, excruciating pain, and a very real possibility of death. For a medieval woman, pregnancy and childbirth were the most dangerous things she would ever experience. Forget the modern image of a sanitized hospital room with fetal monitors and a team of medical professionals. A medieval birth was a grim, bloody, and perilous affair, managed by women in a private room with God and a great deal of luck as the only real hopes for survival. The moment a woman realized she was pregnant, a clock started ticking. While a successful birth brought joy and secured a woman's status, the journey to get there was fraught with danger. Medical understanding of pregnancy was virtually non-existent. There was no prenatal care, no ultrasounds, no way of knowing the position of the baby, or identifying potential complications in advance. A woman's health during pregnancy was a matter of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and prayer. She was advised to avoid certain foods, strong emotions, and even looking at frightening animals, lest her child be born with deformities. The entire process was shrouded in superstition and fear, a mystery unfolding within her own body over which she had absolutely no control. When labor began, the woman would enter a period of confinement, retreating to a darkened, stuffy room, often with the windows shuttered and keyholes blocked to keep out evil spirits and drafts. This was an exclusively female space. Men, including physicians, were strictly forbidden from attending a birth. The process was managed by a local midwife and a group of female relatives and neighbors. While many midwives were experienced and skilled, their knowledge was based on tradition and observation, not scientific understanding. Their tools were their hands, perhaps a few herbal concoctions to ease pain or speed labor, and a collection of prayers and religious relics. The pain of childbirth was, of course, immense and unavoidable. There were no epidurals, no effective anesthetics. A woman might be given alcohol or certain herbs, but these did little to dull the agony of contractions and delivery. The pain was seen as a divine punishment, a direct consequence of Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden. As God said to Eve in the book of Genesis, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." Therefore, a woman's suffering during labor was considered both natural and biblically ordained. To endure it was a woman's sacred, painful duty. The real terror, however, came from the high risk of complications. A baby in the breech position, a tangled umbilical cord, or a labor that went on for days could easily become a death sentence for both mother and child. If a baby became stuck, the midwife's options were horrifyingly limited. She might try to manually turn the baby, a painful and often futile procedure. In the most desperate cases, if the mother was clearly dying, a midwife might perform a rudimentary form of embryotomy, using hooks and knives to dismember the fetus within the womb to save the mother's life. This was a brutal last-ditch effort performed without anesthesia. More commonly, however, if the baby could not be born, both mother and child would die from exhaustion, infection, or internal hemorrhaging. Even if the delivery was successful, the danger was far from over. The period after childbirth was perilous. The risk of postpartum infection, known as childbed fever, was enormous. In an era with no understanding of germs, where hygiene was poor and medical instruments were unsterilized, any internal tearing or retained placenta could lead to a raging infection. A woman could survive the ordeal of labor, only to die days later from a fever, leaving her newborn child motherless. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 women died from causes related to childbirth at some point in their lives. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice. The infant's survival was equally precarious. Infant mortality rates were astronomical, with some estimates suggesting that up to a third of all children died before their first birthday. A difficult birth could injure the baby, and the unhygienic conditions could lead to fatal infections. If the mother died, the baby's chances of survival plummeted, as there were no reliable alternatives to breast milk. Given this terrifying reality, sex was inextricably linked to the prospect of death. For a woman, consenting to sex was, in a very real sense, consenting to risk her life. This wasn't a distant abstract fear. It was an immediate and recurring danger. Every woman knew someone, a sister, a cousin, a neighbor, who had died in childbirth. The birthing chamber was a battlefield, and women were its soldiers. So as you lie in your comfortable bed, perhaps contemplating the relative safety of modern life, spare a thought for the medieval woman. For her, the act that created life was a constant, terrifying dance with death, a brutal reality that shaped her entire existence and cast a long, dark shadow over the very concept of intimacy. Having navigated the terrifying ordeal of childbirth, let's zoom back out to the context in which the act of conception itself took place. If you are imagining a private, intimate moment shared between two people, you are once again applying a modern sensibility to a world that was fundamentally different. The concept of privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist for the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages. Life was a communal public affair, and this lack of personal space extended directly into the bedroom, making true intimacy an almost impossible luxury. For most medieval people, particularly the peasantry who made up over 90% of the population, home was not a sprawling house with separate rooms. It was a small one-room hut, often shared not only with the entire family, but also with livestock. Imagine a simple dwelling with a dirt floor, a thatched roof, and a central hearth for warmth and cooking. In this single, cramped space, you would find parents, children of all ages, perhaps an elderly grandparent, and in many cases, a few chickens, a pig, or even a cow huddled together for warmth during the cold winter months. There were no interior walls, no doors to close, no separate bedrooms to retreat to. In this environment, where could a married couple possibly find a moment alone? The answer is, they couldn't. The marital bed was often just a straw-filled mattress in a corner of the room, perhaps separated from the rest of the space by a single flimsy curtain. This offered a modicum of visual separation, but it did nothing to block out sound. Every cough, every whisper, every rustle of the straw was audible to everyone else in the hut. Children slept nearby, often in the same bed as their parents or on pallets on the floor right next to them. The idea of having sex while your children, parents, and farm animals were just a few feet away, listening to every sound, is a deeply uncomfortable one for the modern mind. But for medieval people, it was simply the reality of life. This lack of privacy profoundly shaped the nature of marital sex. It had to be a quiet, furtive, and efficient affair. There was little room for leisurely exploration, passionate expression, or noisy enthusiasm. The act was likely performed in near silence, under the cover of darkness, with a constant awareness of being overheard. This environment would have fostered a sense of shame and secrecy around sex, even within the sanctioned bounds of marriage. It was a necessary duty to be performed as discreetly as possible, rather than a joyful and open expression of love. The constant presence of others would have been a powerful inhibitor, stripping the act of spontaneity and turning it into a scheduled, whispered task. Even for the wealthy, privacy was a rare commodity. While a lord and lady might have a private bedchamber, or solar, it was far from the secluded sanctuary we might imagine. The concept of a personal servant was taken to an extreme. High-ranking nobles were rarely, if ever, alone. Servants were a constant presence, tasked with attending to their every need. They helped their masters and mistresses dress and undress, they slept on pallets at the foot of the bed, and they were expected to be on hand at all hours of the day and night. The marital bed of a lord was often a grand, four-poster affair with heavy curtains, but these curtains were designed more for warmth and to show off expensive fabric than to provide true privacy. Servants would be just on the other side of the fabric, their presence a constant reminder that the lord and lady were never truly alone. This was especially true on the wedding night. The consummation of a marriage, particularly an aristocratic one, was a semi-public event. After the wedding feast, the couple would be ceremonially escorted to the bedchamber by their family and guests. A priest would bless the bed, and the couple would be undressed by their attendants and put to bed. The guests might linger, making bawdy jokes and offering encouragement, sometimes waiting outside the door or even in the room until the act was completed. This ritual served a practical purpose. It provided witnesses to the consummation, which was legally necessary to validate the marriage and ensure the legitimacy of any future heirs. But it also turned one of the most intimate moments of a couple's life into a public performance, a spectacle for the community. This pervasive lack of privacy reinforced the idea that sex was not a personal matter between two individuals, but a communal concern. It was about producing heirs for the family, providing new members for the village, and fulfilling a social and religious duty. The individual's desire for privacy or personal intimacy was secondary to the needs of the collective. Life was lived out in the open, and the bedroom was no exception. So as you relax in your own private space, perhaps behind a closed and locked door, take a moment to appreciate it. That simple act of closing a door, of creating a boundary between your personal life and the outside world, is a modern luxury that a medieval person could scarcely have imagined. For them, life, love, and sex were all performed on a public stage. Having established the complete lack of privacy in the medieval world, we must now layer on another deeply unsettling element, the state of hygiene. If the thought of having sex in a crowded room is uncomfortable, imagine doing so when no one in that room, including you and your partner, has bathed in weeks or even months. The medieval world was a filthy place by modern standards, and this pervasive grime and lack of sanitation profoundly impacted every aspect of life, including the most intimate ones. The sensory experience of medieval sex would have been, to our modern noses and sensibilities, overwhelmingly unpleasant. First, let's address the issue of bathing. The modern ritual of a daily hot shower with scented soaps and shampoos is a very recent invention. In the Middle Ages, bathing was an infrequent and often complicated affair. While public bathhouses existed in some towns and cities, they were often associated with prostitution and seen as dens of vice by the church, leading to their gradual decline. For most people, a full-body wash was a rare event. Water had to be hauled from a well or river and heated over a fire, a labor-intensive process that no one would undertake daily. A peasant might wash their hands and face in a basin of cold water, but a full bath might happen only a few times a year, if at all. People simply wore their dirt and grime as a part of life. The result was that bodies carried a permanent pungent aroma. The smell of unwashed skin, stale sweat, and greasy hair was the default human scent. Deodorant did not exist. People tried to mask their body odor with herbs or perfumes if they were wealthy, but for the common person there was no escaping the natural, potent smell of an unwashed body. Now place two such bodies together in the marital bed. The intimacy of sex would have been an intimacy of smells, a mingling of odors that would be jarring to a modern person accustomed to clinical cleanliness. Oral hygiene was equally abysmal. Toothbrushes were not in common use. People might chew on twigs or rub their teeth with a rough cloth and perhaps some salt or soot, but these methods were largely ineffective. Dental decay, gum disease, and abscesses were rampant and went untreated. The result was chronic bad breath, or halitosis, often compounded by rotting teeth. A passionate kiss, a fundamental part of modern romance, would have been a very different experience. It would have been an exchange of the smells and tastes of poor digestion, decaying food particles, and infected gums. For many, it was likely an unpleasant prospect to be avoided. Then there is the matter of genital hygiene. Without regular bathing or access to clean water, keeping one's private parts clean was a significant challenge. Underwear, when worn at all by the lower classes, was often a simple linen loincloth that was not changed daily. This lack of cleanliness created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, leading to infections, rashes, and of course, powerful odors. It also meant that sexually transmitted diseases, which we will discuss later, could spread with terrifying ease. The physical act of sex would have involved direct contact with bodies that were, by our standards, profoundly unclean. The environment of the bed itself was no better. As we've noted, most people slept on straw-filled mattresses. This straw was rarely changed and quickly became infested with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. It also absorbed sweat, bodily fluids, and every other kind of human detritus. The marital bed was a thriving ecosystem of filth and parasites. Imagine trying to find a moment of passion while being bitten by fleas and lice on a mattress that smelled of stale sweat and mildew. It's a scenario that is decidedly anti-romantic. Even the very act of sex was messy in a way we have largely forgotten. There were no latex condoms, no disposable wipes, no easy way to clean up afterward. Bodily fluids would have been absorbed by the straw mattress or the rough linen sheets, which, like clothing, were washed infrequently. The lingering dampness and smell would have been a simple fact of life. It is important to remember that medieval people were accustomed to these conditions. They did not know any different. The smells and the filth that would revolt us were the normal sensory backdrop of their existence. Their threshold for what was considered dirty was vastly different from our own. However, this does not change the objective reality of their unhygienic world. The lack of sanitation had real consequences, contributing to the spread of disease and making physical intimacy a far grittier, smellier, and more uncomfortable affair than any romanticized depiction would have you believe. It adds another layer of grim reality to the medieval experience. Sex was not just a duty performed in public. It was a duty performed in filth, a close-quarters encounter with the unwashed reality of the human body. Now that we have a clear and perhaps unpleasantly vivid picture of the physical conditions surrounding medieval sex, the lack of privacy, the pervasive filth, and the ever-present danger of childbirth, we must address a logical question. Did people try to prevent pregnancy? The answer is a resounding yes. Despite the Church's absolute condemnation of any such act, the terror of childbirth and the economic burden of another mouth to feed were powerful motivators. However, their attempts were a desperate and often dangerous mix of folklore, magical thinking, and misunderstood biology. The world of medieval contraception was crude, bizarre, and almost entirely ineffective. The Church's position was unequivocal. The primary and arguably only legitimate purpose of sex was procreation. Any act that intentionally interfered with this purpose was a grave sin, often equated with homicide. Theologians argued that spilling one's seed for any reason other than conception was a violation of natural law and an affront to God. This condemnation covered everything from withdrawal, coitus interruptus, to the use of any physical or herbal barrier. Priests would specifically ask about these practices during confession, and the penances for such sins could be severe, involving years of fasting and prayer. This official prohibition drove the entire practice underground, into the realm of whispered advice, folk remedies, and so-called wise women. Lacking any scientific understanding of how conception actually worked, medieval contraceptive methods were based on flawed logic and superstition. People did not know about ovulation, sperm, or eggs. They operated on ancient theories such as the idea that conception depended on the mixing of male and female seeds, or the right alignment of astrological forces. Consequently, their methods were a shot in the dark, aimed at a target they couldn't see. One of the most common, though still sinful methods was coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method. This was likely the most widely practiced form of birth control, simply because it required no special ingredients or devices. However, it was notoriously unreliable, as it still is today, and it was explicitly condemned by the Church as the sin of Onan. A man confessing this sin would be told he was wasting his seed, a gift from God, and was committing a mortal sin. Beyond withdrawal, people turned to a strange and often disgusting pharmacopoeia of herbal and animal-based remedies. Women would drink infusions made from herbs believed to have contraceptive properties, such as Queen Anne's lace, silphium, which was driven to extinction in antiquity partly due to its popularity as a contraceptive, pennyroyal, and rue. While some of these herbs do indeed have properties that can affect hormones or induce uterine contractions, the dosages were impossible to standardize. An incorrect dose could do nothing at all, or it could be highly toxic, causing violent illness, organ damage, or even death. A woman desperate to avoid another pregnancy might drink a poisonous potion, risking her life in the process. Other methods were based on magical thinking and were even more bizarre. A woman might be advised to wear an amulet containing specific herbs, animal parts, or written charms. For example, the testicles of a weasel, worn in a pouch around the neck, were believed to prevent conception. Another popular belief was that if a woman spit into a frog's mouth 3 times, she would be protected from pregnancy for a year. Some texts suggested that a woman could prevent conception by fumigating her womb with the smoke of a burning mule's hoof, or by drinking the water that a blacksmith had used to cool his tongs. These methods were, of course, completely useless, but in a world desperate for some measure of control, people were willing to try anything. There were also attempts at physical barriers, though they bear little resemblance to modern methods. Women might insert objects into the vagina before intercourse, such as sponges soaked in vinegar or lemon juice, the acidity of which might have a mild spermicidal effect, but was far from reliable. Wads of wool, or even balls of dung. Crocodile dung was a particularly popular, if revolting, choice mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts that likely persisted as folk wisdom. These methods were not only ineffective, but also incredibly unhygienic, dramatically increasing the risk of infections, internal abrasions, and long-term health problems. The sheer desperation evident in these practices speaks volumes about the pressures medieval people faced. The constant threat of a life-threatening pregnancy, coupled with the economic strain of a large family, created a powerful demand for some form of birth control, yet they were trapped between the condemnation of the Church and a profound ignorance of their own bodies. Their attempts were a testament to human ingenuity and a desire for agency, but they were ultimately futile and often dangerous. They were fighting a biological reality they did not understand with tools of magic and folklore. So, as you consider the ease and reliability of modern contraception, remember a time when preventing a pregnancy involved risking your soul with the Church and your life with a poisonous herb or a weasel's testicle. It was a gamble in the dark, with the highest possible stakes. Having explored the desperate and ineffective world of medieval contraception, we must now turn our attention back to the Church's rulebook. We've established that sex was only for procreation within marriage, but the regulations didn't stop there. The Church's obsession with stripping pleasure from the act led to an incredibly detailed and often bizarre list of forbidden acts and positions. Theologians and confessors created a complex taxonomy of sin, where every deviation from the natural procreative act was meticulously categorized and assigned a penance. The marital bed was not a space for exploration or mutual pleasure. It was a tightly choreographed ritual with one correct form and 1,000 sinful variations. The cornerstone of this sexual jurisprudence was the concept of natural versus unnatural acts. A natural act was one in which male seed was deposited in the proper vessel, the vagina, in a way that could lead to conception. Any other act was unnatural, and therefore a sin against God and nature. This wasn't just a minor transgression. It was often considered a more grievous sin than adultery or even rape, because while those acts were sins against a person, an unnatural act was a sin directly against the divine order of creation. At the top of the list of forbidden positions was, well, almost everything. As we touched on earlier, the only universally accepted position was the one deemed least pleasurable and most sober, the missionary position, or as it was sometimes known, the Florentine position. The man was to be on top, the woman on her back, with minimal movement or passion. This was seen as the most direct and efficient way to achieve conception without indulging in excessive lust. Any other configuration was viewed with deep suspicion. The woman on top position was particularly condemned. Theologians argued it was a grotesque inversion of the natural hierarchy. God had made man the head of the woman, and this should be reflected even in the act of intercourse. For a woman to be on top was an act of pride and dominance, an attempt to usurp the man's God-given authority. It was seen as inherently lustful, as it was believed to give more pleasure to the woman, which was not the point of the exercise. A couple confessing to this sin could expect a heavy penance. Rear entry positions, often referred to as the way of the dog or the way of the beast, were also strictly forbidden. This was seen as degrading human dignity, reducing people to the level of animals. It was an act of pure lust, divorced from the solemnity of procreation, and was considered a grave sin. The same condemnation applied to standing positions, sitting positions, or any other creative arrangement a couple might devise. The message was clear. Sex was not supposed to be fun or varied. It was a solemn duty to be performed in one specific, unexciting way. Beyond positions, the Church condemned a wide range of other sexual behaviors. Oral sex was considered a particularly heinous sin of uncleanness. Because it could never lead to procreation and was purely for pleasure, it was seen as a profound perversion of the sexual act. The mouth was for eating and for praising God, not for such filthy acts. The penances for oral sex were among the most severe, sometimes involving years of fasting. Similarly, anal sex, even between a married couple, was considered the grave sin of sodomy. It was the ultimate unnatural act, a complete frustration of the procreative purpose of sex, and was often punished with extreme prejudice, both by the Church and by secular law. Masturbation, whether mutual or solitary, was also a serious sin. It was the spilling of seed for no purpose, a selfish act of lust that wasted the potential for life. Confessors would ask pointed questions about self-pollution, and penances were designed to curb this solitary vice. Even a husband's thoughts were policed. He was instructed not to look at his wife's naked body with lust, but to approach the marital act with a sense of sober duty. The idea of foreplay or any act designed simply to arouse a partner was viewed with suspicion, as it elevated pleasure over procreation. This intricate web of rules was laid out in documents called penitentials. These were manuals for priests providing a detailed list of sins and their corresponding penances. They read like bizarre, invasive legal codes for the bedroom. For example, a penitential might prescribe 40 days of fasting on bread and water for using a forbidden position, and several years of penance for more serious sins like oral sex. The severity of the penance often depended on the couple's intent. Was the act performed out of ignorance or out of a deliberate desire for lustful pleasure? The latter was, of course, far worse. The psychological effect of this constant scrutiny cannot be overstated. It created a culture of guilt, shame, and anxiety around the most natural of human impulses. A married couple could never be sure if they were acting correctly in the eyes of God. They were forced to view their own bodies and desires as potential sources of damnation. The marital bed, instead of being a place of refuge and connection, became a courtroom where every move was judged against a rigid and unforgiving moral code. It was another way in which the medieval world stripped intimacy of its joy, transforming it into a perilous duty fraught with spiritual danger. After mapping out the labyrinthine rules of what was permissible in the marital bed, we must now address a fundamental injustice that permeated every aspect of medieval life, including sexuality, the profound and deeply ingrained double standard for men and women. While the Church's laws in theory applied to everyone, the reality of their enforcement and the weight of social expectation were vastly different for the two sexes. A man's sexual indiscretions were often viewed as an unfortunate but understandable lapse, a minor flaw in his nature. A woman's, however, were seen as a catastrophic moral failing, a stain on her family's honor, and a crime that could warrant the most severe punishments. The root of this double standard lay in the very concept of ownership and property. In medieval society, a woman's sexuality was not her own. Before marriage, her virginity was a valuable asset belonging to her family, a key bargaining chip in the marriage market. A daughter who was not a virgin was considered damaged goods, and her marriage prospects, along with her family's reputation, could be ruined. After marriage, her sexuality and reproductive capacity became the exclusive property of her husband. Her primary duty was to produce legitimate heirs to inherit his name and property. Therefore, a woman's fidelity was not just a matter of personal morality, it was a matter of property law and dynastic succession. For a man, the rules were entirely different. His sexuality was his own. While the Church condemned adultery for men as well, society was far more lenient. A man's affair, particularly with a lower-class woman or a prostitute, was often seen as a regrettable but natural outlet for his supposedly uncontrollable lust. It did not threaten the legitimacy of his heirs, as any children born from such a union would be bastards with no claim to his inheritance. His wife was still at home, ready to produce the legitimate children that mattered. A man's affair was a personal sin. A woman's affair was a crime against her husband's lineage and property rights. This disparity was reflected in both law and social custom. An adulterous wife could face brutal consequences. Depending on the time and place, she could be publicly shamed, flogged, cast out of her home, or even executed. In some legal codes, a husband who caught his wife in the act of adultery had the legal right to kill both her and her lover on the spot. Her transgression was seen as so fundamental that it justified the most extreme violence. An adulterous husband, on the other hand, faced far milder repercussions. His wife had little legal recourse. She could not divorce him or have him publicly punished. At most, she might appeal to a church court, which might impose a penance on him, but it would do little to change his behavior or the societal acceptance of it. His affair was an inconvenience or a personal betrayal, but it did not rock the foundations of the social order in the same way a wife's did. The very language used reflected this. A man committed adultery, but a woman was an adulteress, her identity consumed by the sin. This double standard extended beyond adultery. A man's premarital sexual experience was often ignored or even tacitly accepted as a normal part of growing up. It was assumed that young men had strong sexual urges that needed an outlet. A young woman, however, was expected to be a paragon of chastity. Her entire value was tied to her virginity. She was guarded closely by her family, her movements restricted, and her interactions with men strictly policed. The slightest rumor of impropriety could destroy her reputation and her future. The concept of female desire itself was viewed with deep suspicion. Women were often portrayed in clerical writings as inherently more lustful and morally weaker than men, a direct legacy of Eve, who tempted Adam and brought sin into the world. This created a bizarre paradox. Women were believed to be dangerously sexual creatures who at the same time had to be completely chaste. A woman who expressed sexual desire was seen as deviant and dangerous. A good woman was supposed to be passive and submissive, enduring sex as a duty rather than actively enjoying it. A man's libido was seen as natural. A woman's was a sign of moral corruption. This created an impossible situation for women. They were trapped by contradictory expectations. They were responsible for managing their husband's sexual needs to prevent him from sinning, yet they were not supposed to be sexual beings themselves. They were seen as the gatekeepers of morality, yet were simultaneously distrusted as inherently sinful. A man could sow his wild oats, but a woman's entire life could be ruined by a single misstep. This profound inequality was not just a social custom, it was the bedrock of the medieval patriarchal order. It ensured that men controlled not only property and politics, but also the very bodies and reputations of the women in their lives, creating a system where sexual freedom was a male prerogative and sexual purity was a female burden. Given the strict marital rules, the terror of childbirth, and the severe double standard imposed on women, it's no surprise that a parallel world of sexuality existed, operating in the shadows of official morality. This was the world of prostitution. While the church condemned it as a sin, secular authorities and even many theologians viewed it with a kind of pragmatic resignation. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was often seen as a necessary evil, an unpleasant but essential institution that protected the social order by providing an outlet for uncontrollable male lust, thereby safeguarding the chastity of respectable women. The logic, however flawed, was straightforward. It was widely believed that men, particularly young unmarried men like apprentices, students, and soldiers, possessed a powerful and unruly sexual appetite. If this appetite were not satisfied, it was feared they would turn their attentions to the virtuous wives and daughters of the community, leading to seduction, rape, and social chaos. The prostitute, therefore, served as a sort of social sewer, a designated vessel to contain and channel away the filth of male lust, keeping the rest of the city clean. St. Augustine himself famously used this analogy, comparing prostitution to a cesspool in a palace. Remove the cesspool and the palace will be filled with pollution. It was a sin, yes, but a sin that prevented greater sins. This pragmatic acceptance led to a surprising degree of regulation and official sanction. In many medieval towns and cities, prostitution was not only tolerated but organized and controlled by municipal authorities. Brothels, known as stews or bawdy houses, were often confined to specific districts, sometimes marked by a red lantern or a similar sign. This created red light districts where the trade was contained and could be monitored. These districts were often located near the city walls or across a river, physically separated from the respectable parts of town. City governments would issue detailed regulations for these establishments. They might set the prices for services, dictate the hours of operation. Brothels were often required to close on Sundays and religious holidays, and even prescribe the clothing prostitutes were allowed to wear. Prostitutes were often forced to wear a specific item of clothing, a striped hood, a yellow sash, or a special badge, to distinguish them from honorable women. This was both a mark of shame and a practical measure to prevent them from accidentally mixing with the general female population. The authorities were not trying to protect the prostitutes. They were trying to protect the social order from the perceived contamination of their presence. The lives of the prostitutes themselves were grim and precarious. While a few high-class courtesans might achieve a degree of wealth and influence, the vast majority of prostitutes were poor, desperate women with few other options. They might be orphans, widows, or women who had been cast out by their families for having a child out of wedlock. For them, prostitution was not a choice, but a means of survival in a world that offered them no other way to earn a living. They were at the bottom of the social ladder, simultaneously essential and despised. They faced constant threats of violence, both from their clients and from the pimps or bawds who often controlled them. They were highly vulnerable to disease. With no access to effective medical care, The very nature of their work put them in constant violation of the Church's moral code, meaning they lived in a state of perpetual sin, with the threat of eternal damnation hanging over their heads. Some regulations, in a small nod to their spiritual welfare, might require prostitutes to attend a special sermon once a year, but for the most part, their souls were considered lost. The relationship between the prostitute and the community was deeply hypocritical. Men from all walks of life, students, merchants, knights, and even priests, frequented the brothels. It was an open secret. Yet the women who provided this service were publicly scorned and ostracized. They were a necessary part of the city's functioning, yet they were treated as social lepers. They absorbed the community's sins and, in return, were branded with its shame. This institution highlights the deep contradictions at the heart of medieval sexuality. It shows a society that publicly preached a rigid code of chastity and marital fidelity, while privately acknowledging and even organizing a system built on illicit sex. It demonstrates the immense pressure placed on the concept of female virginity, a pressure so great that an entire class of women had to be sacrificed to maintain it for others. The medieval prostitute was a walking paradox, a sinner whose sin was deemed necessary for the preservation of virtue, a pariah who was an integral part of the urban landscape. Her existence was a testament to the failure of the official moral code to contain the complexities of human desire. While prostitution operated in a gray area of grudging acceptance, there was another form of sexuality that was pushed so far into the shadows it was barely spoken of, and when it was with utter condemnation and horror. This was the world of same-sex relationships. In an era obsessed with procreation as the sole justification for sex, any act between two people of the same gender was seen as the ultimate unnatural sin, a sterile and monstrous perversion of God's plan. The persecution of homosexuality in the Middle Ages was severe, systematic, and often deadly. In the early Middle Ages, attitudes were somewhat more ambiguous. While clerical writers condemned same-sex acts, enforcement was inconsistent, and some evidence suggests a degree of tolerance in certain warrior cultures or monastic communities. However, from the 12th century onward, a dramatic shift occurred. As the Church consolidated its power and society became more regulated, a persecuting society began to emerge. Heretics, Jews, and lepers were increasingly marginalized and attacked, and homosexuals, or more accurately, those accused of the sin of sodomy, were added to this list of internal enemies. The term sodomy was a broad and terrifyingly vague catch-all. It was derived from the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by God for their wickedness. Theologians interpreted this wickedness primarily as same-sex intercourse. The term could encompass a range of unnatural acts, including anal sex between a man and a woman, bestiality, and any sexual contact between two men or two women. However, its primary association was with male homosexuality. It was considered a sin that cried out to heaven for vengeance, a crime so vile that it could provoke divine wrath in the form of plagues, famines, or earthquakes upon the entire community where it was tolerated. This belief transformed same-sex desire from a personal sin into a public menace. The persecution was driven by a potent combination of religious doctrine, social anxiety, and political opportunism. Secular rulers, eager to demonstrate their piety and consolidate their authority, began to enact increasingly harsh laws against sodomy. What was once a matter for a priest in the confessional became a capital crime. For men, the punishments were brutal. The law codes of the time prescribed a horrifying range of penalties. An accused man could be castrated, flogged, or exiled. Increasingly, the prescribed punishment was death, often by burning. Burning was a particularly symbolic punishment. It was seen as a purifying fire that could cleanse the community of the sinner's contagion, and it left no body for burial in consecrated ground, ensuring the sinner's damnation was complete. Accusations of sodomy became a powerful political weapon. If a king or a powerful lord wanted to eliminate a rival, accusing them of sodomy was an effective way to destroy their reputation and life, regardless of the truth. The Knights Templar, a wealthy and powerful military order, were famously brought down in the early 14th century on a list of trumped-up charges that included heresy and institutionalized sodomy. Because of this intense persecution, evidence of male same-sex relationships is scarce and often coded. We have court records of trials and executions, theological condemnations, and a few tantalizing hints of love and affection in personal letters or poetry, where the language is deliberately ambiguous. Men who felt such desires had to live in a state of constant fear, their lives dependent on absolute secrecy. Any expression of their true feelings could lead to a horrific death. The experience of women is even more hidden from the historical record. Medieval society was so male-dominated that the idea of a sexual relationship that did not involve a man was almost inconceivable to many clerical and legal writers. Lesbianism was often ignored or downplayed, as it did not involve the spilling of seed, which was the primary obsession of theologians. It was seen as a lesser sin, a form of uncleanness or unnatural vice, that women might engage in out of foolishness or lust. However, this does not mean it was accepted. When it was acknowledged, it was condemned. Some penitentials prescribed penances for women who used instruments to simulate sex with each other. In a few rare cases, women were prosecuted and even executed for same-sex acts, but it was far less common than the persecution of men. For both men and women, the concept of a homosexual identity as we understand it today did not exist. There was no sense of a distinct group of people defined by their sexual orientation. There were only sinful acts. A person was not a sodomite. They were a person who had committed the sin of sodomy. This meant that anyone could potentially be accused. This lack of a concept of identity, combined with the extreme danger, made it impossible for any kind of community or subculture to form. Individuals were isolated in their fear, their desires deemed monstrous by the world around them. They were forced to live a lie, marry, and have children to conform to social expectations, their inner lives a secret kept under the constant threat of exposure and a brutal death. After exploring the grim realities of forbidden love and persecuted desires, let's venture into a slightly more whimsical, though no less dangerous corner of medieval sexuality, the world of aphrodisiacs, love potions, and magical charms. In a society where marriage was a contract and personal choice was limited, it's hardly surprising that people turned to magic in a desperate attempt to manipulate the forces of love and lust. If you couldn't win someone's heart through natural means, perhaps you could ensnare it with a magic potion. This was a world where folklore, medicine, and magic were hopelessly entangled, producing a bizarre and often disgusting array of supposed solutions for the lovelorn. The desire to inspire love or lust in another person is as old as humanity itself, but in the Middle Ages it took on a particular urgency. A woman might seek a potion to ensure her husband's fidelity, or to win the affection of a man she desired but could not have. A man might seek an aphrodisiac to overcome impotence, a condition that brought great shame and could even be grounds for annulling a marriage, or simply to enhance his virility. This created a thriving underground market for love magic, supplied by village, wise women, cunning men, and traveling charlatans who promised miraculous results for the right price. The church naturally took a very dim view of all this. The use of love magic was strictly condemned as a form of witchcraft and demonic interference. It was seen as an attempt to subvert God's will and an individual's free will, forcing a person into an unnatural affection through diabolical means. Confessors would specifically ask about the use of philters, love potions, and charms, and the penances could be severe. Secular authorities also treated it as a serious crime, especially if the potion caused harm or death. Despite this official condemnation, the practice was widespread, a testament to the power of human desperation. The ingredients for these concoctions ranged from the mundane to the truly grotesque, based on a combination of herbal lore and the principle of sympathetic magic, the idea that like produces like. For aphrodisiacs, many ingredients were chosen for their suggestive shapes or perceived hot and moist properties, which were believed to correspond to the humors of the body associated with lust. Foods like leeks, onions, and parsnips were popular, as were more exotic spices like pepper and ginger. Certain animal parts were also highly prized. The testicles of various animals, from roosters to boars, were a common ingredient, believed to directly transfer virility to the consumer. Things got much stranger and more disturbing when the goal was to create a binding love potion. Here, the ingredients often involved bodily fluids and other personal items, believed to create a powerful magical link between two people. A woman might be instructed to bake a cake using her own sweat, menstrual blood, or vaginal secretions, and feed it to the man she desired. The belief was that by consuming a part of her, he would become magically bound to her. One infamous recipe for a love cake involved mixing flour with one's own bodily fluids and baking it in an oven heated with ferns gathered on St. John's Eve. Other recipes were even more macabre. They might call for the heart of a dove, the brain of a sparrow, or the bones of a green frog that had been stripped clean by ants in a churchyard. Sometimes the potion required an element from the target themselves, a lock of hair, a nail clipping, or a thread from their clothing, which would be mixed into the brew to create the magical connection. These ingredients were often combined with specific herbs and recited incantations, performed at astrologically significant times, such as under a full moon. The danger of these practices was twofold. First, there was the spiritual danger. In the eyes of the church, anyone dabbling in such arts was opening a door to the devil. They were risking their immortal soul for a temporary earthly desire. Second, there was the very real physical danger. The people mixing these potions had no knowledge of chemistry or pharmacology. They were combining ingredients based on folklore. Many of the herbs used could be toxic in the wrong doses. A potion meant to inspire love could easily become a poison that caused violent illness or death. If a person died after being given such a potion, the provider could be tried and executed for both murder and witchcraft. This strange world of love magic reveals the anxieties at the heart of medieval society. It shows a world where people felt powerless over their own romantic and sexual lives, trapped by social conventions and loveless marriages. They turned to magic not just for love, but for a sense of agency, a belief that they could exert some control over their own destinies. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, a secret ritual performed in the hopes of changing reality. So, while you might swipe right on a dating app to find a match, remember a time when finding love might involve feeding someone a cake made with your own sweat and the heart of a pigeon, and risking both your life and your soul in the process. After delving into the world of man-made magic and potions, we must now turn to a fear that was even more profound and terrifying: the belief in supernatural seduction. The medieval world was perceived as a porous place, where the veil between the physical and spiritual realms was thin. People believed that demons and other malevolent spirits could and did cross over into the human world, not just to cause plagues or tempt souls, but to engage in physical, sexual acts with mortals. This was the terrifying belief in the incubus and the succubus, a fear that turned the bedroom into a potential site of demonic violation. The incubus, from the Latin incubare, to lie upon, was a male demon believed to prey upon women, while the succubus, from succubare, to lie under, was his female counterpart, who seduced men. This was not seen as a mere fantasy or a psychological phenomenon. To the medieval mind, these encounters were terrifyingly real. Theologians, including influential figures like Thomas Aquinas, debated the mechanics of these demonic liaisons with scholastic seriousness. They weren't questioning if it happened, but how it was possible for a spiritual being to have physical intercourse with a human. The prevailing theory was as intricate as it was bizarre. It was believed that demons, being spirits, had no bodies of their own and could not procreate. Therefore, they had to operate through a kind of supernatural subterfuge. A demon, in the form of a succubus, would first have sex with a man and collect his seed. Then the same demon would transform into an incubus, travel to a woman, often while she was sleeping and vulnerable, and use the stolen seed to impregnate her. This elaborate theory served several purposes. It explained how a spirit could cause a physical pregnancy, and it accounted for stories of changelings or monstrous births, which were believed to be the offspring of such demonic unions. The child of an incubus, known as a cambion, was thought to be born without a soul, often possessing supernatural abilities and a malevolent nature. The legendary wizard Merlin was one of the most famous figures reputed to have been fathered by an incubus. For an ordinary person, the fear of these nocturnal visitors was deeply personal and terrifying. A woman might wake up feeling as though she had been physically violated in her sleep, and the only explanation her worldview could offer was an attack by an incubus. These experiences, which modern psychology might interpret as sleep paralysis, vivid dreams, or nocturnal emissions, were filtered through the lens of demonic reality. The encounter was described as being physically brutal and unpleasant. The incubus was often said to be unnaturally heavy, with icy cold skin and a grotesquely large or misshapen sexual organ, sometimes described as being forked or made of iron. The act was not one of seduction but of painful demonic rape, leaving the victim physically sore and spiritually tainted. Men visited by a succubus faced a different kind of terror. The succubus was often depicted as a figure of irresistible beauty, a temptress who would lure a man into sin, draining him not only of his seed but of his vital energy and his soul. A man who engaged with a succubus, even in a dream, was believed to be committing a grave sin, a form of spiritual adultery that put his salvation in jeopardy. Chronic fatigue, illness, or wasting away could all be blamed on the repeated visits of a succubus. The fear was that these encounters, while perhaps pleasurable in the moment, were a demonic trap leading to damnation. This belief had profound and dangerous social consequences, particularly for women. An accusation of having sex with a demon was a serious matter. A woman who gave birth to a deformed child, or who was known to have vivid or disturbing dreams, could be suspected of consorting with an incubus. This suspicion could easily escalate into a full-blown accusation of witchcraft. During the height of the witch hunts in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, confessing to sexual intercourse with the devil, who was often seen as the ultimate incubus, became a standard feature of witch trials. Women were tortured until they confessed to attending witches' sabbaths, where they engaged in orgies with demons and pledged their souls to Satan. The fear of the incubus and succubus served as a powerful tool for social control. It reinforced the idea that sexuality, especially female sexuality, was a dangerous force that could attract demonic attention, if not properly contained within marriage and governed by the rules of the church. It provided a supernatural explanation for things that were not understood, such as birth defects, sudden infant death, and sexual dreams. And it created a pervasive anxiety that the bedroom was not a safe space. Even when you were alone, asleep in your own bed, you were not safe from violation. The devil and his minions were always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip through the veil and turn a moment of intimacy, or even just a dream, into an act of spiritual and physical corruption. It was a belief that populated the darkness with monsters, making sleep itself a perilous journey into a world where human desire and demonic hunger could become terrifyingly intertwined. Having explored the supernatural fears that haunted the medieval bedroom, let's return to the more mundane, yet equally powerful forces that shaped people's intimate lives: social status and wealth. In the rigidly hierarchical society of the Middle Ages, the class you were born into dictated almost every aspect of your existence, from the food you ate to the clothes you wore. It should come as no surprise then that it also profoundly governed your sexual freedoms, opportunities, and experiences. The rules may have been written by the church for everyone, but they were applied, bent, and broken in vastly different ways depending on whether you were a peasant, a merchant, or a lord. For the vast peasant majority, life was a grind of subsistence farming, and sexuality was inextricably tied to labor and survival. As we've discussed, marriage was a practical partnership, and children were a future labor force. The lack of privacy and the constant physical exhaustion of manual labor would have left little room for the leisurely pursuit of romance or pleasure. Sex was likely a straightforward functional act, performed quietly and quickly in the corner of a one-room hut. However, peasants were also subject to the sexual whims of their social superiors. The concept of droit du seigneur, or the right of the lord, which supposedly gave a feudal lord the right to have sex with a vassal's bride on her wedding night, is largely considered a myth by modern historians, but the underlying reality it represents is not. A lord or his reeve had immense power over the peasants who lived on his land, and there was little to stop him from coercing or forcing himself upon a peasant woman. Her husband or father would be powerless to object, as their livelihood and even their lives depended on the lord's goodwill. For a peasant woman, her body was not truly her own. It was vulnerable to the predations of the powerful. Moving up the social ladder to the burgeoning merchant class in the towns and cities, we find a different set of pressures. Here, reputation and the stability of the family business were paramount. Marriages were strategic alliances designed to merge businesses, consolidate wealth, and produce heirs to carry on the family trade. A daughter's virginity was a crucial asset, and a wife's fidelity was essential to ensure that the family fortune would pass to a legitimate heir. The urban environment, however, also offered more opportunities for illicit encounters. The anonymity of the city, the presence of taverns, bathhouses, and regulated brothels created a world where a man of means could seek pleasure outside of the marital bed with relative ease and social acceptance. His wife, meanwhile, was expected to remain a paragon of virtue, managing the household and upholding the family's good name. It is at the apex of the social pyramid, among the high nobility, that the disconnect between official morality and actual behavior becomes most stark. This was a class with the time, money, and privacy, relative as it was, to engage in complex games of love and intrigue. While their marriages were rigidly controlled political contracts, the aristocracy developed a sophisticated culture of courtly love, which we will explore in more detail later. In its idealized form, this was a non-physical, chivalrous devotion of a knight to a high-born lady. In practice, however, the line between idealized devotion and actual adultery was often blurred. The courts of Europe were rife with affairs and scandals. A powerful lord or king operated with near-total sexual impunity. He could take mistresses, father illegitimate children, who were sometimes acknowledged and raised at court, and engage in affairs with the wives of his courtiers with few consequences. King Henry I of England, for example, holds the record for the most acknowledged illegitimate children of any English monarch, fathering over 20 bastards with a string of mistresses. These affairs were not hidden. They were a public demonstration of his virility and power. For a powerful man, having mistresses was a status symbol. For a noble woman, the situation was more perilous. While some high-ranking women did take lovers, the risks were enormous. If discovered, a queen or a high-born lady could be divorced, disgraced, imprisoned in a convent, or even executed. Her affair threatened the one thing that mattered most: the legitimacy of the royal or noble bloodline. The story of Anne Boleyn, executed on charges of adultery and treason, serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers a woman faced, even at the very top of the social hierarchy. Wealth also determined one's ability to navigate the church's legal system. While divorce was not permitted, a wealthy and powerful man who wanted to end his marriage could often find a way. He could petition the church for an annulment, claiming that the marriage was invalid from the start due to some impediment, such as the couple being too closely related, consanguinity, or a prior, unfulfilled marriage contract. These legal proceedings were expensive and complex, far beyond the reach of an ordinary person. A peasant was stuck in their marriage for life, no matter how unhappy it was. A king or a powerful duke, however, could often buy or bully his way to a favorable verdict, allowing him to set aside one wife and take another in the hopes of producing a male heir. In essence, social status created a sliding scale of sexual morality. The poor were constrained by their circumstances and vulnerable to the powerful. The middle class was constrained by the need to maintain their reputation and wealth, and the powerful, particularly powerful men, could often act as if the rules simply did not apply to them. Wealth and power provided a buffer against both social condemnation and divine retribution, creating a world where the sins of the rich were often overlooked, while the sins of the poor were punished with the full force of the law. Having established how social status created a landscape of sexual privilege and vulnerability, we must now confront one of the darkest and most brutal realities of the medieval world: the prevalence of sexual violence. In a society built on a rigid hierarchy and a profound power imbalance between men and women, rape was a grim and tragically common feature of life. It was a crime that was poorly understood, inconsistently punished, and often shrouded in a culture of victim blaming, leaving survivors with little hope for justice or healing. To understand the medieval approach to rape, we must first discard our modern legal and psychological definitions. Today we understand rape as a violent crime, centered on a violation of consent and bodily autonomy. In the Middle Ages, the concept was far more ambiguous and was viewed primarily through the lens of property, honor, and social status. The crime was often seen not as a violation of the woman herself, but as a crime against the man who owned her father, or her husband. The legal definition of rape, or raptus, was complex. The term could refer not only to forced intercourse but also to abduction or elopement. This conflation of forced sex with the theft of a woman from her male guardian shows how the crime was framed. When a man raped an unmarried virgin, the primary legal injury was to her father. The rapist had damaged his property, reducing her value on the marriage market and staining the family's honor. The legal remedy, therefore, was often financial compensation paid directly to the father. In some cases, the rapist could be forced to marry the woman he had raped. provided he was of a suitable social status, a solution that effectively erased the crime by transforming the rapist into a legitimate husband. To the modern mind, this is horrifying, but in the medieval context it was seen as a way to restore the woman's lost honor and provide her with the financial security of a husband. If the victim was a married woman, the crime was seen as an egregious offense against her husband's property and honor. It was a form of theft and adultery rolled into one, and the legal penalties could be severe, at least in theory. However, the enforcement of these laws was fraught with difficulty. For a rape accusation to be taken seriously, a woman had to follow a strict and humiliating procedure. She was expected to raise the hue and cry immediately after the assault, running to the nearest town with her clothes torn and her hair disheveled, showing visible signs of her struggle. She had to display her injuries and her blood or semen-stained clothing to credible witnesses and report the crime to the authorities without delay. Any hesitation or deviation from this script could be used to discredit her testimony. If she waited a day, she would be asked why she had not cried out sooner. If she had no visible bruises or torn clothing, it would be assumed she had not resisted and therefore must have consented. The burden of proof was placed entirely on the victim, and her own character and reputation would be put on trial. Was she known to be chaste and honorable, or was she a woman of loose morals? A woman with a questionable reputation, a prostitute, or even a poor peasant woman, stood little chance of having her accusation believed against a man of higher standing. The concept of consent itself was murky. It was widely believed that a true rape could not result in pregnancy, based on the ancient medical theory that a woman's pleasure or assent was necessary for conception. If a woman became pregnant after an assault, it was often taken as proof that she had secretly enjoyed the act and therefore consented. This cruel and ignorant belief placed victims in an impossible double bind. Furthermore, the idea of marital rape was completely non-existent. A husband, as we've discussed, had a legal and religious right to his wife's body. He could not, by definition, rape his own wife. She was his property, and her consent was assumed to be a permanent condition of the marriage contract. The context of war made sexual violence even more widespread and permissible. The rape of women in a conquered town or territory was seen as a standard, if regrettable, part of a soldier's spoils. It was a brutal way of demonstrating dominance, terrorizing the defeated population, and rewarding the victorious army. While commanders might occasionally issue orders against it, these were rarely enforced, and the mass rape of civilian women was a common feature of medieval warfare. For the women who survived these assaults, the consequences were devastating. Beyond the physical and psychological trauma, they faced social ruin. A raped woman was often seen as polluted or stained, regardless of her innocence. She might be unmarriageable, cast out by her family, and left with no means of support. If she became pregnant, she would bear the stigma of having an illegitimate child. There was no concept of trauma counseling or support systems. A survivor was left to deal with the aftermath alone, in a society that was more likely to blame her for the assault than to offer her compassion. The crime of rape in the Middle Ages was not just a physical violation. It was a social and spiritual destruction, a brutal act compounded by a system that offered little justice and even less empathy. After confronting the brutal reality of sexual violence, it is crucial to understand the intellectual landscape that underpinned all of these beliefs and practices. A profound and pervasive medical ignorance of the human body. The medieval understanding of anatomy, reproduction, and sexuality was not based on scientific observation or empirical evidence. Instead, it was a confused and often contradictory mixture of ancient Greek philosophy, biblical interpretation, and folk superstition. This lack of knowledge had devastating consequences, contributing to the dangers of childbirth, the ineffectiveness of contraception, and the perpetuation of harmful myths about male and female bodies. The foundation of medieval medical theory was the work of ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates, and most importantly, Galen of Pergamon, who lived in the 2nd century AD. Galen's writings were treated with almost biblical reverence, and his theories dominated European medicine for over 300 years. The problem was that Galen's understanding of human anatomy was deeply flawed. Human dissection was taboo in Roman society, so Galen based his anatomical models primarily on the dissection of animals, such as Barbary apes, pigs, and goats. He then extrapolated these findings to humans, leading to significant errors. For centuries, physicians were essentially studying a distorted, animal-based version of the human body. One of Galen's most influential and incorrect theories was the one-sex model. He did not see male and female bodies as fundamentally different, but rather as variations of a single form. He believed that the female reproductive organs were simply an inverted, internalized, and inferior version of the male's. The ovaries were female testicles, the uterus was a female scrotum, and the vagina was an inverted penis. This was not just a neutral anatomical observation. It was laden with value judgments. The male form was seen as perfect, hot, and dry, while the female form was imperfect, cold, and moist. This heat was believed to be what pushed the male genitals outside the body, while a woman's lack of heat meant her genitals remained inside underdeveloped. This theory provided a scientific justification for the perceived inferiority of women, grounding social prejudice in a flawed biological model. The process of reproduction was equally misunderstood. The dominant theory, inherited from Aristotle, was that the male seed was the active, life-giving principle, while the female played a passive role, providing the matter, in the form of menstrual blood, in which the seed could grow. The man provided the form and the soul. The woman provided the incubator. A competing theory from Galen suggested that women also produced a seed, and that conception required the mixing of both male and female seeds. This led to the erroneous belief, as we've discussed, that a woman's pleasure and orgasm were necessary for conception, a belief that had terrible consequences for victims of rape. There was no understanding of ovulation. It was generally believed that a woman was fertile throughout her menstrual cycle, or perhaps most fertile just after menstruation, when the womb was thought to be clean and ready to receive the male seed. The existence of the human egg was not discovered until the 19th century. This ignorance meant that any attempts at timing-based contraception were doomed to fail. They had no idea when a woman was actually fertile, making the rhythm method an impossibility. The causes of venereal diseases were a complete mystery. They were often seen as a form of corruption or divine punishment for the sin of lust. Without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, there was no concept of how these diseases were transmitted, other than through the act of sex itself. Treatments were useless and often harmful, involving toxic substances like mercury, which caused more suffering than the disease itself. This lack of knowledge contributed to the terror and stigma surrounding these illnesses. Medical texts of the period were filled with bizarre and inaccurate descriptions of the reproductive organs. The uterus was sometimes depicted as having 7 chambers, 3 on the right for male fetuses, 3 on the left for female fetuses, and 1 in the middle for hermaphrodites. It was also believed that the womb could wander around the body, causing a condition known as hysteria, from the Greek hystera for uterus. A wandering womb could be coaxed back into place with sweet-smelling substances applied to the vagina and foul-smelling ones held to the nose. This profound ignorance meant that people were living in bodies they did not understand. Their most intimate functions were shrouded in mystery and explained through the lens of sin, superstition, and flawed ancient science. Physicians and midwives were operating in the dark, their interventions often doing more harm than good. This lack of knowledge was not just an academic problem, it had life and death consequences every single day. It made childbirth a terrifying gamble, contraception a dangerous guessing game, and disease an incurable curse. It was a world where the fundamental workings of life were a mystery, and the human body was a strange and unpredictable vessel, governed by forces that no one truly comprehended. Flowing directly from this profound medical ignorance was the terrifying and untreatable reality of venereal diseases. In an age without antibiotics, without a germ theory of disease, and with only the most rudimentary understanding of how infections spread, contracting a sexually transmitted disease was not just a matter of shame or discomfort. It was often a slow, agonizing, and incurable death sentence. The medieval world was rife with illnesses that were passed through sexual contact, and the fear and stigma surrounding them were as destructive as the diseases themselves. Before the late 15th century, the most common venereal diseases were likely gonorrhea and various forms of genital sores and warts, perhaps caused by herpes or HPV. These were unpleasant and chronic conditions, but they were often not fatal. Gonorrhea, known as the clap, a name possibly derived from the Parisian district Les Clapiers, where prostitutes congregated, caused painful urination and discharge. Medieval treatments were bizarre and ineffective, ranging from dietary restrictions to the insertion of probes and caustic substances into the urethra, which undoubtedly caused more pain and damage. However, the real game changer arrived in Europe in the 1490s, likely brought back from the Americas by the cruise of Christopher Columbus. This was the arrival of syphilis. The disease spread like wildfire across the continent, its devastating effects unlike anything seen before. This new and terrifying illness became known by many names, often used to blame other nations. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Italians and Germans called it the French disease, and the Russians called it the Polish disease. Eventually, the name syphilis, from a 1530 poem, stuck. The course of syphilis was horrifying and unfolded in distinct stages. The primary stage began with a painless chancre, or sore, at the site of infection. This would eventually disappear, leading the sufferer to believe they were cured, but the disease was merely lying dormant. Weeks or months later, the secondary stage would erupt. This involved a fever, sore throat, and a gruesome body-covering rash of pustules and weeping sores. The victim's hair would fall out, and they would be racked with joint pain. This stage was highly contagious and deeply disfiguring, marking the sufferer as a pariah. After the secondary stage, the disease could again seem to disappear, entering a latent phase that could last for years. But for many, the tertiary stage would eventually arrive, and it was the most horrific of all. The disease would attack the internal organs, the cardiovascular system, and the central nervous system. It caused large rubbery tumors called gummas to grow on the skin, in the bones, and throughout the body. These could eat away at the flesh, famously causing the cartilage of the nose to collapse, leaving a gaping hole in the center of the face. It could lead to heart failure, paralysis, blindness, and most terrifyingly, madness. The neurological effects of late-stage syphilis caused profound dementia, personality changes, and delusions, as the disease literally ate away at the brain. There was no cure. Physicians were powerless against this new plague. The most common treatment, which became popular in the 16th century, and was used for centuries after, was mercury. Patients were subjected to mercury rubs, baths, and even ingested the toxic heavy metal. The theory was that the mercury would drive out the poison of the disease. The treatment induced massive salivation, which was seen as a sign that it was working. The saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," summed up the grim reality. The mercury treatment was agonizingly painful, and often killed the patient faster than the disease itself, causing kidney failure, neurological damage, and tooth loss. The social and moral consequences of syphilis were immense. Because it was transmitted sexually, it was immediately seen as a divine punishment for lust and sin. Sufferers were not just sick, they were morally condemned. They were shunned, ostracized, and treated as if their physical decay was a direct reflection of their spiritual corruption. Hospitals, known as lock hospitals, were established to quarantine sufferers, but they were more like prisons than places of healing. The disease added a new layer of terror to sexuality. Any illicit encounter, any moment of passion outside the safe confines of a faithful marriage, could lead to a lifetime of disfigurement, madness, and pain. This terror permeated the culture. Skulls and skeletons became common motifs in art, the memento mori, or reminder of death, reflecting a society grappling with this new, invisible killer. The fear of venereal disease reinforced the Church's message about the dangers of extramarital sex with a terrifying, tangible reality. It was a physical manifestation of the wages of sin. So, as you consider the simple efficacy of a course of penicillin, remember a time when a single sexual encounter could condemn you to a slow, public, and incurable decay. A world where the pleasures of the flesh could lead directly to a living hell from which there was no escape. After confronting the grim and terrifying realities of disease and violence, it might seem like there was no room at all for romance in the medieval world. And yet, this is the very period that gave birth to the concept of courtly love, a highly stylized and influential tradition of romantic expression that has shaped our modern ideas of love and chivalry. However, if you're picturing knights and ladies consummating their passionate affairs, you are once again falling for a romantic illusion. The reality of courtly love was far more complex, and in its purest form, it was a game of the heart and mind, not the body. The tradition of courtly love emerged in the aristocratic courts of southern France in the 11th and 12th centuries and quickly spread across Europe. It was primarily a literary and cultural phenomenon, popularized by troubadours, poet-musicians who traveled from court to court, singing songs of love and chivalry. These songs and poems laid out a new and revolutionary code of conduct for love between the sexes, one that stood in stark contrast to the brutish, contractual nature of most medieval marriages. At the heart of courtly love was the idea of the knight or nobleman who devotes himself entirely to the service of a high-born lady. This lady was typically of a higher social standing and, crucially, was almost always married to someone else. The love the knight felt for her was not a simple affection. It was an all-consuming, ennobling passion. It was a love that was meant to be secret, illicit, and, most importantly, unfulfilled. The knight's love for his lady was a source of both exquisite suffering and moral improvement. His longing for her inspired him to be a better man, more courageous in battle, more virtuous in his conduct, and more refined in his manners. He would perform great deeds in her name, wear her colors in tournaments, and write poetry praising her beauty and virtue, all in the hopes of winning a small sign of her favor, a glance, a smile, or a word of encouragement. The relationship was deliberately modeled on the feudal bond between a lord and his vassal. The lover served his lady. He pledged his undying loyalty to her, called her maidens, my lord, and submitted himself completely to her will. She was his sovereign, and he was her humble servant. This dynamic was a radical inversion of the typical medieval power structure, where men held all the authority. In the world of courtly love, the lady was in complete control. She held the power to grant or withhold her favor, and the lover was kept in a perpetual state of hopeful, agonizing suspense. The key to understanding courtly love is that, in its idealized form, it was chaste. The love was meant to be a spiritual and emotional connection, not a physical one. The knight's desire was to be constantly tantalized but never fully satisfied. The tension of this unrequited love was the very thing that fueled his heroic deeds and artistic expression. To actually consummate the affair would be to break the spell, to bring the lofty, idealized love down to the messy, mundane level of ordinary sex. It would destroy the beautiful suffering that was the whole point of the exercise. The famous story of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere is a perfect example of courtly love tipping over into a physical affair, and the result is the destruction of Camelot and the entire chivalric ideal. Their consummated love was a tragedy, not a triumph. Of course, we must ask, was it always so chaste in reality? The answer is almost certainly no. It is naive to think that all of these intense, secret, and emotionally charged relationships remained purely platonic. The poetry and literature of courtly love are filled with longing, desire, and thinly veiled eroticism. It created a social space where men and women could interact with a degree of emotional intimacy that was absent from their formal, arranged marriages. It provided a language and a justification for extramarital attraction. For some, the game of courtly love likely served as a sophisticated cover for actual adultery. It allowed a nobleman and a noblewoman to conduct an affair under the guise of a fashionable and culturally acceptable literary convention. However, the importance of courtly love does not lie in whether or not people were actually having sex. Its true significance is that it was the first time in Western culture that love was celebrated as a noble and transformative experience in its own right, separate from the practicalities of marriage and procreation. It elevated the status of women, at least of noble women, to that of an inspirational and civilizing force. It introduced the ideas that are now central to our concept of romance. The idea of falling in love, of love at first sight, of the lover's sleepless nights and secret suffering, and of love as a force that can make you a better person. So while the reality of medieval sex was often brutal, unhygienic, and fraught with danger, the aristocracy was simultaneously playing a beautiful and elaborate game of pretend. Courtly love was an escape, a romantic fantasy built to contrast with the grim reality of their contractual marriages. It was a testament to the human need for emotional connection and passion, even in a world that did its best to suppress them. It was an illusion, yes, but a powerful one that would leave a lasting legacy, forever changing the way we think and talk about love. While the aristocracy played their elaborate games of courtly love, for the vast majority of the population, the reality of sex outside of marriage was far from romantic. It was a grave risk, fraught with social, legal, and spiritual consequences. The church and secular authorities worked in tandem to police the boundaries of marital fidelity, and anyone caught transgressing them could expect public shame, harsh punishments, and eternal damnation. Fornication, sex between two unmarried people, and adultery, sex involving at least one married person, were not just personal failings. They were crimes against the social and divine order. Fornication, while considered a serious sin, was generally treated as a lesser offense than adultery. The primary concern was the potential for illegitimate children. An illegitimate child, or bastard, had no legal standing, no right to inherit property, and brought shame upon the entire family. They were a living symbol of sin and disorder. To prevent this, communities put immense pressure on young people to remain chaste until marriage. A young man and woman who were caught having sex might be pressured by their families and the village priest to marry immediately, turning their sin into a legitimate union. This was often the most practical solution, as it gave the child a name and a place in the social structure. If marriage was not possible, the couple would face punishment from the church courts. These courts, which operated alongside the secular legal system, were responsible for enforcing moral and religious law. A couple found guilty of fornication could be forced to perform public penance. This was a deeply humiliating ritual designed to shame the sinners and serve as a warning to others. They might be whipped at the church door, forced to stand through Sunday service barefoot and clad only in a white sheet, a symbol of penitence, or made to lead a procession through the village while announcing their sin. The goal was public degradation, a ritual cleansing of the community's moral fabric. Adultery was considered a far more serious crime, as it violated the sacred vow of marriage. As we've discussed, the consequences were vastly different for men and women. A man's adultery was a sin against God, but a woman's was a sin against God and a crime against her husband's property rights. The fear of an illegitimate heir inheriting the family property made female adultery a threat to the very foundation of the patriarchal order. The punishments for an adulterous woman were correspondingly brutal. Public humiliation was the least of her worries. She could be cast out of her home, losing her children, her property, and her social standing. Secular laws in many places allowed for corporal punishment such as flogging or branding. In some regions, a woman could be drowned or even buried alive. The ordeal by water, though more common for witchcraft, was sometimes used. The accused would be thrown into a river. If she floated, she was guilty, as the pure water had rejected her, and if she sank, she was innocent, though often dead. As mentioned before, a husband who discovered his wife in the act had, in many legal traditions, the right to kill her and her lover without facing murder charges. This was considered a justifiable, if tragic, defense of his honor. The lover of a married woman also faced severe consequences. He had not only committed a sin, but had also trespassed on another man's property. He could be fined, flogged, castrated, or executed. The discovery of an affair could lead to violent blood feuds between families, as the dishonored husband sought vengeance. The social consequences were just as devastating as the legal ones. In the small, close-knit communities of the Middle Ages, reputation was everything. A woman accused of adultery, even if she was not formally punished, would be ostracized for life. She would be the subject of gossip, scorn, and social isolation. No one would trust her, and her family would be shamed by association. She would become a social outcast, a walking symbol of female frailty and sin. Given these immense risks, any non-marital affair had to be conducted with the utmost secrecy. It required a level of deception and discretion that was difficult to maintain in a world with no privacy. A secret meeting in a barn, a whispered conversation at the market, a stolen glance in church. Every interaction was fraught with the danger of discovery. This constant fear of exposure, combined with the crushing weight of guilt and the terror of the consequences, meant that sex outside of marriage was not an act of carefree passion. It was a high-stakes gamble, a rebellion against a rigid system where the price of a moment's pleasure could be public humiliation, brutal punishment, and the complete destruction of one's life. After considering the severe dangers of extramarital affairs, we must address one of the most infamous and misunderstood symbols of medieval sexual control: the chastity belt. The very image of a locked iron contraption designed to physically prevent a woman from having sex has become a powerful and enduring symbol of medieval jealousy, oppression, and barbarism. It speaks to a world where a man's control over a woman's body was so absolute that he would literally lock her up. However, the story of the chastity belt is not as straightforward as it seems. It is a fascinating case where myth, fantasy, and reality have become almost inextricably tangled. Let's begin with the popular myth. The story usually goes like this. A knight or a lord, about to depart for a long journey such as a crusade or a military campaign, would lock his wife into a chastity belt to ensure her fidelity while he was away. The device, made of iron and leather, would be fitted around her waist and between her legs, featuring small openings for bodily functions, but making intercourse impossible. The husband would pocket the key, leaving his wife a virtual prisoner in her own body, a walking testament to his possessive jealousy. This image is powerful, evocative, and perfectly encapsulates the darkest aspects of medieval patriarchy. The problem with this story is that there is almost no reliable historical evidence to suggest that chastity belts were actually used in the Middle Ages. The vast majority of historians now consider the medieval chastity belt to be a myth, a product of later centuries' fascination with the perceived darkness and brutality of the medieval period. The first detailed descriptions and illustrations of such devices do not appear until the 15th century, right at the very end of the medieval period, and even these are often satirical or allegorical in nature, not depictions of real, functional objects. Let's consider the practicalities. An iron and leather device locked permanently onto a person's body for months or years would have been a death sentence. In an era of poor hygiene, the constant rubbing and chafing of the device against the skin would have quickly led to sores, abrasions, and raging infections. The accumulation of sweat, dirt, and menstrual blood would have created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. The result would have been sepsis and a painful death. It was simply not a survivable or practical device for long-term use. So where did the idea come from? The concept seems to have gained traction during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. These periods were keen to define themselves as eras of reason and progress, and they did so by contrasting themselves with the preceding Dark Ages. The chastity belt became a convenient and powerful symbol of medieval ignorance and oppression. It was a piece of anti-medieval propaganda. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Victorian era, there was a surge of interest in medievalism and also a profound societal anxiety about female sexuality. This is when many of the chastity belts that we see in museums today were likely created, either as curiosities, forgeries for gullible collectors, or in some cases, as actual devices intended for different purposes. Some of these later devices were not for enforcing fidelity, but were designed as anti-masturbation tools for young people of both sexes. In an era deeply concerned with the supposed medical dangers of self-pollution, these belts were seen as a way to prevent a perceived moral and physical decay. Other examples may have been used as protective devices against rape, or even as bizarre erotic novelties. But their connection to medieval crusaders is almost entirely fictional. While the physical device may be a myth, the idea of the chastity belt is still historically significant. It reflects a very real anxiety about female fidelity and a deep-seated desire for male control. The fact that later generations invented and believed in this device tells us a great deal about how they viewed the Middle Ages and how they perceived the relationship between men and women. The chastity belt is a symbol of a truth, even if it is not a literal historical fact. It represents the reality that a woman's sexuality was considered the property of her husband, to be guarded and controlled. The medieval world had other non-mechanical ways of enforcing chastity. Social pressure, religious doctrine, constant surveillance by family and community, and the threat of brutal punishment were the true chastity belts of the era. A woman's virtue was policed by her entire society. She was locked not in a cage of iron, but in a cage of expectations, fear, and patriarchal control. The myth of the chastity belt serves as a crude physical metaphor for this less tangible, but no less powerful system of oppression. It is a story we tell ourselves about the past to make sense of the very real power imbalances that governed medieval life. So, while the crusader likely never pocketed a literal key, the desire to control, to own, and to lock away a woman's sexuality was a very real and pervasive force in the medieval world. After examining the mythical iron cage of the chastity belt, let's turn to the very real psychological cage that governed medieval sexuality, the sacrament of confession and the system of penance. For an ordinary person, the The most direct and recurring interaction with the Church's intricate rulebook of sexual morality came in the dark, intimate space of the confessional. It was here that individuals were forced to scrutinize their own thoughts and actions, confess their most secret sins to a priest, and receive a prescribed punishment designed to purify their souls. This process turned every parishioner into their own moral police officer, internalizing the Church's gaze and creating a powerful system of self-surveillance. The practice of private confession became widespread and mandatory after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which decreed that all Christians who had reached the age of reason must confess their sins to their local priest at least once a year, typically during Lent before receiving Easter Communion. This was a transformative moment. It shifted the focus from public penance for public crimes to the private examination of one's conscience. The priest was no longer just a community leader. He became a physician of the soul, tasked with diagnosing the spiritual sickness of sin and prescribing a cure. For the laity, this was an intimidating prospect. The priest, who was often the most educated person in the village and held the keys to eternal salvation, would ask a series of probing questions designed to uncover every possible transgression. And no area was probed more thoroughly than that of sexual conduct. As we've seen, the Church had a detailed and complex understanding of sexual sin, and priests were armed with penitentials, those manuals of sin, to guide their interrogations. Imagine yourself as a medieval peasant kneeling before the priest. He would not just ask, "Have you committed adultery?" He would delve into the specifics. "Have you had relations with your wife on a Sunday? During Lent? While she was menstruating? Have you used any unnatural positions? Have you spilled your seed in vain? Have you had lustful thoughts about another woman? Have you touched yourself in an impure way?" The questions were designed to be comprehensive and invasive, leaving no corner of one's private life unexamined. The penitent was expected to answer honestly and completely. To deliberately hide a mortal sin in confession was itself a grave sin of sacrilege, compounding the original offense. This process had a profound psychological effect. It forced people to think about their sexuality in the terms dictated by the Church. They learned to see their natural desires as sinful, their bodies as sources of temptation, and their intimate moments as potential transgressions. It fostered a deep sense of guilt and anxiety. The very act of thinking a lustful thought was now a sin that needed to be confessed and accounted for. This created a state of constant moral vigilance, where one's inner world was subject to the same scrutiny as one's outer actions. Once the confession was complete, the priest would assign a penance. The purpose of penance was threefold. It was a punishment for the sin, a medicine to heal the soul, and a deterrent against future temptation. The severity of the penance depended on the gravity of the sin. For minor sexual transgressions, the penance might be the recitation of a certain number of prayers, such as the Our Father or Hail Mary. For more serious sins, the penances were much harsher. A common penance was fasting. This could range from abstaining from meat on certain days to a prolonged period of eating only bread and water. Fasting was seen as a way to discipline the body, to bring the rebellious flesh under the control of the spirit. Pilgrimage was another form of penance. A sinner might be ordered to walk to a local shrine or, for the most grievous sins, to undertake a long and dangerous journey to a major pilgrimage site like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem. This was a physical and spiritual ordeal, a way to earn forgiveness through suffering and devotion. Almsgiving, or giving money to the poor, was another option, particularly for the wealthy who could afford to substitute financial sacrifice for physical hardship. For the most serious sexual sins, such as sodomy, bestiality, or incest, the penances could be lifelong. The sinner might be excommunicated, cast out of the community of the faithful, or forced to enter a monastery to live out their days in prayer and repentance. This system of confession and penance was a powerful tool of social control. It gave the Church an intimate window into the lives of its flock and a direct mechanism for enforcing its moral code. It turned every priest into a judge and every parishioner into a potential sinner in need of correction. It ensured that the rules governing sexuality were not just abstract doctrines, but a lived, recurring reality in the life of every individual. It was a system that aimed to regulate desire from the inside out, creating a world where the fear of God's judgment was a constant and powerful presence in the most private and intimate corners of human experience. After examining the psychological control exerted through confession, we must turn to a specific biological reality that was laden with a disproportionate amount of religious and social taboo: menstruation. In the medieval world, a woman's monthly cycle was not seen as a natural and healthy biological process. Instead, it was viewed through a lens of impurity, sin, and danger. This perception, rooted in ancient religious texts and medical ignorance, placed menstruating women in a state of temporary ritual uncleanness, further marginalizing them in a society already structured around their perceived inferiority. The foundation for these beliefs was firmly laid in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 15 provides explicit rules regarding bodily discharges, stating that a menstruating woman is unclean for 7 days. Anything she touches or sits on becomes unclean, and anyone who touches her or those objects also becomes unclean until they have washed themselves and their clothes. While Christian theology had moved away from many of the stricter Jewish purity laws, this deep-seated association between menstruation and impurity persisted and permeated medieval thought. This religious taboo was reinforced by the flawed medical theories of the time. Following the teachings of Galen, medieval physicians believed that menstruation was a process by which women expelled their excess humors. Because women were considered cold and moist by nature, they were thought to be incapable of burning off their bodily impurities through activity and sweat, as men supposedly did. Therefore, their bodies had to purge this excess corrupt material once a month. Menstrual blood was not seen as ordinary blood. It was viewed as a toxic, venomous substance, the physical manifestation of a woman's inherent imperfection and humoral imbalance. This belief led to a host of bizarre and dangerous superstitions. The Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, whose works were widely read in the Middle Ages, wrote that a menstruating woman's gaze could tarnish a mirror, blunt the edge of a knife, and cause crops to wither. He claimed that dogs who tasted menstrual blood would become rabid. These fantastical ideas were taken seriously and contributed to a genuine fear of menstruating women. They were seen as being in a temporarily dangerous and polluting state, their bodies exuding a mysterious and harmful influence. These beliefs had practical consequences for a woman's daily life. Following the Levitical tradition, a menstruating woman was often forbidden from entering a church or receiving communion. The idea of her unclean body coming into contact with the sacred space of the church or the consecrated host was considered sacrilegious. This effectively barred women from full participation in the central rituals of their faith for a significant portion of their lives. Within the home, a menstruating woman was subject to a range of restrictions. She was often forbidden from engaging in certain domestic activities, particularly those involving food preparation. It was believed that her touch could cause wine to turn to vinegar, dough to fail to rise, or meat to spoil. This was not just a superstition. It was a deeply held belief about the physical properties of her body during her cycle. Sex during menstruation was, of course, strictly forbidden. This was one of the few rules on which both religious and medical authorities were in complete agreement. From a religious perspective, it was a violation of the purity laws laid out in Leviticus. From a medical perspective, it was considered extremely dangerous. It was believed that intercourse with a menstruating woman could cause a man's body to rot or develop leprosy. Furthermore, it was thought that any child conceived from such a union would be born with red hair, a sign of Judas, epilepsy, or some other deformity, marked for life by the venomous blood present at their conception. The practical management of menstruation was also a challenge. There were no disposable pads or tampons. Women likely used wads of cloth, known as rags, moss, or wool to absorb the flow. These would have to be washed and reused, a difficult task in an era with limited access to clean water and soap. The constant potential for leaks and stains would have been a source of anxiety and shame, especially given the powerful taboos surrounding the entire process. The experience of menstruation, therefore, was one of shame, secrecy, and isolation. It was a monthly reminder of a woman's perceived inferiority and impurity. It was not a sign of health and fertility, but a mark of her cold, imperfect nature and her connection to the original sin of Eve. It was a biological process that was completely misunderstood, shrouded in fear, and used as another justification for excluding women from positions of spiritual and social authority. While a man's body was the norm, a woman's body, with its cyclical bleeding, was seen as strange, mysterious, and dangerously impure. Having explored the many restrictions and taboos that governed medieval sexuality, let's now turn to the one moment where sex was not just permitted, but publicly mandated: the wedding night. The consummation of a marriage was not a private, romantic moment for the newlyweds to discover each other. Instead, it was a crucial legal and social ritual, a semi-public event designed to finalize the marriage contract and ensure its validity. The pressure, awkwardness, and lack of privacy surrounding the wedding night turned it into a performance rather than an intimate experience. The day of the wedding was a long affair, beginning with the ceremony at the church door and followed by a nuptial mass and a celebratory feast. The feast was a public affirmation of the new union, involving the families and the wider community. There would be food, drink, music, and often bawdy jokes and songs, all building up to the main event of the evening, the bedding of the bride and groom. As the feast wound down, a formal procession would begin. The newlyweds, often accompanied by their parents, friends, and even the local priest, would be escorted from the hall to the bedchamber. This was not a quiet retreat. It was a noisy, celebratory, and public affair. The crowd would follow the couple to the threshold of the room and sometimes right into it. The bed itself, particularly in an aristocratic marriage, would be a focal point. It would have been specially prepared, perhaps with new linens, and a priest would perform a ritual blessing, sprinkling it with holy water to ward off evil spirits and ensure the couple's fertility. This act transformed the bed from a simple piece of furniture into a sacred, ritual space. What followed was a process that would be deeply uncomfortable to the modern mind. The bride and groom would be ceremonially undressed, not by each other, but by their attendants. The bride's ladies-in-waiting or female relatives would remove her gown, while the groom's friends would help him out of his clothes. This was often accompanied by more jokes and ribald commentary from the onlookers. The couple, now in their nightclothes or perhaps even naked, would be formally put to bed together. Even then, the privacy was not absolute. The guests might not leave immediately. They might linger in the room, offering last-minute advice or encouragement, or stand just outside the closed door, waiting for evidence that the marriage had been consummated. In some traditions, a bedding stocking ritual took place where the guests would take turns throwing a stocking at the couple. The first to hit one of them on the head was said to be the next to marry. The entire atmosphere was one of public spectacle and communal participation in what we now consider a deeply private act. The pressure on the couple, particularly if they were young and inexperienced, must have been immense. They were likely virtual strangers, having been brought together by an arranged marriage. They were now expected to perform the most intimate of acts, knowing that their family and community were, in a sense, listening at the door. The primary purpose of this first sexual encounter was not pleasure or connection. It was legal. A marriage was not considered legally binding until it had been consummated. If the marriage remained unconsummated, it could be grounds for an annulment. Therefore, this first act of intercourse was a legal necessity, the final seal on the contract. For the bride, the experience could be particularly terrifying. She was likely a virgin, raised to believe that sex was a sinful and dangerous business, and was now expected to submit to a man she barely knew. The act itself could be painful, and she was expected to produce proof of her virginity. After the consummation, the blood-stained bedsheets were sometimes displayed publicly the next morning. This was a triumphant moment for the families, a public confirmation of the bride's honor and the legitimacy of the union. But for the young woman at the center of it, it was the ultimate violation of privacy. Her most intimate physical experience turned into a public trophy. For the groom, there was the pressure to perform. Impotence was a source of great shame, and could also be grounds for an annulment. If he was unable to consummate the marriage, he would be seen as a failure, and the entire marriage contract could be voided. The combination of alcohol from the feast, performance anxiety, and sheer inexperience could make this a very real possibility. The wedding night, therefore, was the culmination of the medieval view of sex. It was public, not private. It was a legal and social duty, not an act of personal love. It was focused on legitimacy and procreation, not pleasure. It was a performance, staged for the benefit of the community, where the two individuals at its center were actors in a drama that was much larger than themselves. It was the final public step in the transfer of a woman from her father's property to her husband's, a transaction sealed not with a kiss, but with a witnessed and verified act of intercourse. After wading through a world of contractual marriage, public consummation, rampant disease, and oppressive religious doctrine, a simple and fundamental question arises. Did anyone in the Middle Ages actually fall in love? Amidst all the rules, risks, and grim realities, was there any room for genuine, tender affection and emotional connection between two people? It is easy to look at the evidence and conclude that love, as we understand it, was a rare commodity. And while it was certainly not the foundation of most relationships, to say it didn't exist at all would be to misunderstand the resilience of the human heart. The primary obstacle to love, as we've seen, was the institution of arranged marriage. When spouses were chosen for political and economic reasons, mutual affection was a happy accident rather than a prerequisite. A young couple, often strangers to each other, were bound together for life in a relationship built on duty and obligation. Their primary goal was not to love each other but to manage a household, produce heirs, and uphold their family's standing. The power imbalance inherent in medieval marriage also worked against the development of a loving partnership. A wife was legally and socially subordinate to her husband. He was her master, and she was his property. This is not a dynamic that easily fosters the kind of equality, mutual respect, and shared vulnerability that are the hallmarks of modern romantic love. The relationship was, by its very nature, hierarchical. However, to assume that no love could grow in this soil is to take too cynical a view. While love might not have been the starting point, it could certainly be the destination. A husband and wife bound together by fate would share a life of profound intimacy, not necessarily sexual, but the intimacy of shared experience. They would face the same hardships, the struggle to make a living, the fear of famine and plague, the joy of a successful harvest, and the profound grief of losing a child, an almost universal experience in an age of high infant mortality. This shared journey through the trials of life could and often did forge a powerful and lasting bond. This was not the passionate, all-consuming love of courtly romance, but a quieter, more pragmatic affection. It was a love born of companionship, mutual dependence, and a shared history. It was a love that grew slowly, like a sturdy tree, rooted in the soil of everyday life. We can catch glimpses of this affection in the historical record, though it is often hard to find. Personal letters, which are rare from this period, sometimes reveal a deep and abiding tenderness between spouses. Wills might contain bequests from a husband to his beloved wife, leaving her more than the law required, suggesting a genuine desire to provide for her after his death. Epitaphs on tombs sometimes speak of a couple who lived together in love for 40 years. We can also see evidence of affection in the actions people took. There are records of husbands who went to great lengths to ransom a wife captured in war, or wives who managed the family estate with great skill and loyalty while their husbands were away. The popular folk ballads and stories of the time, while not direct evidence, often celebrate the cleverness of wives and the devotion of husbands, suggesting that the ideal of a loving, functional partnership was present in the popular imagination. It is also important to remember that not all marriages were arranged, especially among the lower classes. While practicality was always a major consideration, young peasants in a village often had a degree of choice in whom they married. They grew up together, worked in the fields together, and danced together at village festivals. These shared experiences could certainly lead to genuine attachments and love matches. The church, in fact, technically required that both parties give their free consent for a marriage to be valid, and while this was often a mere formality in aristocratic circles, it held more weight at the village level. Even the church's rigid doctrines, in a strange way, sometimes reinforced the marital bond. The absolute prohibition of divorce meant that a couple was bound together for life, for better or for worse. This permanence could encourage them to work through their differences and invest in the relationship, knowing there was no easy way out. The emphasis on the marital debt and the importance of procreation, while unromantic, also ensured a degree of physical and functional intimacy that could form the basis of a deeper connection. So, while the grand, passionate, romantic love that we see in movies was likely a rarity, it is a mistake to think of the medieval world as entirely loveless. Affection existed, but it was a different kind of affection from our modern ideal. It was quieter, more resilient, and forged in the crucible of a harsh and unforgiving world. It was a love based on shared duty, companionship, and the simple, profound act of surviving together. It was a rare commodity, perhaps, but like any rare commodity, it was likely treasured all the more by those who were fortunate enough to find it. Having examined the social customs, religious doctrines, and personal affections that shaped medieval sexuality, we must now turn to the cold, hard framework that underpinned it all: the law. While the Church's moral law, enforced through the confessional, governed the spiritual lives of individuals, it was the secular law of kings and lords that governed their physical bodies. The legal systems of the Middle Ages were a complex patchwork of Roman law, Germanic custom, and royal decree, and they had a great deal to say about who could have sex with whom, and what the consequences would be for breaking the rules. The primary concern of secular law regarding sex was not sin, but property, order, and inheritance. While lawmakers were certainly influenced by Christian morality, their main goal was to maintain the stability of the social hierarchy and ensure the orderly transfer of wealth and land from one generation to the next. This meant that the law was overwhelmingly concerned with policing female sexuality, as the legitimacy of heirs was the cornerstone of the entire system. As we've discussed in the context of rape and adultery, the law viewed women primarily as property. An unmarried woman was the property of her father. A married woman was the property of her husband. Therefore, sexual crimes were often framed as property crimes. The laws against raptus, abduction, or rape were designed to compensate a man for the damage done to his daughter or wife. The penalties were often financial, paid to the male guardian, or involved forcing the perpetrator to marry his victim, thereby restoring her economic value. This legal framework reveals a world where female bodily autonomy was not a recognized concept. Marriage itself was a legal contract, and secular courts were often involved in disputes over dowries, property, and the validity of the marriage agreement. While the Church claimed ultimate authority over the sacrament of marriage, secular rulers often asserted their own jurisdiction, particularly when the marriage involved powerful noble families and large tracts of land. The law was a tool used to enforce the economic and political aspects of the marital alliance. Secular law was also instrumental in the persecution of unnatural sexual acts, working in tandem with the Church. The crime of sodomy was gradually incorporated into secular legal codes across Europe, transforming it from a sin requiring penance into a felony punishable by the state. This process intensified in the High Middle Ages. In 13th century France, for example, the law prescribed burning for a first-time offender. In parts of Italy and Spain, the penalties were equally brutal. This criminalization gave secular rulers a powerful weapon. An accusation of sodomy, much like an accusation of heresy or treason, could be used to eliminate political enemies, confiscate their property, and send a terrifying message to any other potential dissenters. The law was not just enforcing morality, it was enforcing political conformity. The legal status of prostitutes is another area where secular law played a crucial role. As we've seen, many towns and cities chose to regulate prostitution rather than outlaw it. This was a legal and economic decision. By creating regulated brothels, city authorities could contain the trade, tax it, and use it as a tool of social control. The laws governing these establishments were incredibly detailed. They might specify the location of the brothel, the clothing the women had to wear, and the medical inspections they had to undergo. These laws were not designed to protect the women, but to protect the public from the perceived moral and physical contamination of the trade. The prostitute existed in a strange legal limbo. Her profession was officially sanctioned and taxed, yet she had few legal rights and was considered a social outcast. The law also drew a sharp distinction between the legitimate and the illegitimate. A child born within a legally recognized marriage was a legitimate heir with full rights to inherit. A bastard, a child born outside of marriage, had almost no legal rights at all. They could not inherit property or titles from their father unless he specifically legitimized them. A rare and complicated process. They were a legal non-entity, a constant reminder of illicit sex, and their presence in the community was a source of shame. The law, therefore, created a powerful incentive to confine all sexual activity within the bounds of marriage. What becomes clear is that the legal framework of the Middle Ages was not a system designed to protect individual rights or promote justice in the modern sense. It was a system designed to maintain a rigid social and economic order. It did this by controlling bodies, particularly female bodies, and by punishing any sexual behavior that threatened the clear lines of inheritance and property ownership. It was a system that valued order over love, property over persons, and legitimacy over liberty. The laws governing sex were not about intimacy or desire. They were about power, and they served to reinforce the authority of the church, the state, and above all, the patriarch at the head of the family. We have now journeyed through the strange and often brutal landscape of medieval sexuality. We have explored the iron grip of the church, the cold calculus of marriage, the terror of childbirth, the filth of daily life, and the pervasive fear of sin, disease, and damnation. We have seen a world where sex was rarely a private matter, almost never about personal fulfillment, and was always entangled with issues of property, power, and social control. As we draw our journey to a close, we must consider the lasting impact of this era, the long shadow it cast, and the legacy of repression and fear that it bequeathed to the modern world. The medieval period fundamentally shaped the Western attitude toward sex, and many of the anxieties and contradictions that defined it are still with us today, albeit in different forms. The most profound legacy is the deep-seated connection between sexuality, guilt, and sin. The idea that sex is inherently dirty, that pleasure is suspicious, and that our natural desires are something to be controlled and ashamed of, is a direct inheritance from medieval Christian theology. For centuries, the Church's teachings were the primary lens through which Western culture understood human sexuality, and this has left an indelible mark on our collective psyche. The shame that many people still feel about their bodies, the difficulty we have in talking openly about sex, and the moral panics that periodically erupt over sexual behavior can all be traced back to this foundation of fear and repression. The double standard for men and women, which was so starkly defined in the Middle Ages, has also had a remarkably long life. The idea that a man's sexuality is active and aggressive while a woman's should be passive and receptive, the pressure on women to be both chaste and desirable, and the tendency to judge women more harshly for their sexual behavior are all echoes of the medieval patriarchal order. The policing of female bodies, the anxiety over female desire, and the link between a woman's virtue and her family's honor are themes that have resonated through the centuries and continue to influence social dynamics today. Furthermore, the medieval fear of unnatural sex has had a long and destructive legacy, particularly in the persecution of homosexuals. The legal and theological frameworks that defined sodomy as a crime against God and nature were not dismantled at the end of the Middle Ages. They were carried forward, adapted, and used to justify centuries of discrimination, violence, and legal persecution against LGBTQ+ people. The idea that there is only one correct or natural way to express love and desire is a powerful and persistent medieval relic. However, the medieval period also left us with a more positive, if paradoxical, legacy. In the midst of all the repression, it was the era that invented romance. The tradition of courtly love, for all its artifice and contradictions, was the first time that love was separated from procreation and celebrated as a transformative, ennobling experience. It introduced a new language of devotion, longing, and chivalry that has become a cornerstone of our modern romantic ideals. The idea that love should be a passionate, all-consuming connection between two individuals, a force that transcends social convention, is a revolutionary concept that has its roots in the songs of the troubadours. We live with this dual legacy, a deep-seated cultural anxiety about the dangers of sex, coexisting with a powerful belief in the transcendent power of romantic love. And so our long and perhaps boring history of medieval sex comes to an end. We have seen a world that is almost alien to our own, a world without privacy, without hygiene, without modern medicine, and without our understanding of love and consent. It was a world where the most intimate act was governed by 1,000 fears: the fear of God, the fear of disease, the fear of pregnancy, the fear of damnation, and the fear of social ruin. As you lie here now in the comfort and safety of your own bed, in a world where you have the freedom to choose whom you love and the knowledge to understand your own body, take a moment to appreciate the profound distance we have traveled. Let the grim realities of the past serve as a quiet backdrop to the peace of your present moment. Let the anxieties of that long-ago world dissolve into the darkness of your room. You are safe from the judgment of the priest, the danger of the birthing chamber, and the terror of the incurable disease. All that is left is the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Feel the softness of your pillow, the weight of your blanket. Let your body relax, and let your mind drift. The long, strange history is over. Now there is only sleep.